All right. Hello, LinkedIn fam. This is Monique Braham-Evans, and you are in for a treat today as we have Jay Patel joining us for a Don't Stay Silent episode, where this time we're talking about racism's far-reaching impact here and also abroad. Jay, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi guys, I'm Jay. I actually work with Monique, and I think just to give you a bit of background on myself, so I've worked with Monique on a few internal projects in the wake of George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matter movement gaining a bit more momentum this side of the pond over in the UK as well. So thanks Monique for inviting me along to speak today as well. I'm really grateful to be doing this and for and being able to speak to you more often these days as well. And today I'm going to be speaking a bit about racism in the UK. So going to talk to you, Monique, about some of the things that we experience over here, acknowledging that my lived experience as a male and of Indian origin isn't the same as some people of colour in the UK, but I think I've been engaged in this area for a while, so I thought I'll give some context about what goes on here, and then we can talk through how different or similar that is to the US experience.
And if I might add, this is an organic conversation because, Jay, this is something that you're very passionate about. And we've had so many offline conversations. And I just said, I want to bring this to my Don't Stay Silent family. So here we are today.
Yeah.
I'm like to kick it off. All right. So in America, we celebrate Black History Month every February. And I know we're in the midst of Black History Month in England right now. I bring this up to say that this isn't just a timely topic, but Blacks in America often feel like the celebration of our history, who we are, our contributions, and our meaning and impact on culture are celebrated just once a year and during the shortest month of the year at that. Bill Burr, he just talked about it in his monologue on Saturday Night Live. Not a lot of people were happy, but I think the Black people were. But, we get the commercials aired every year, in February, and the same heroes are celebrated over and over again in our schools. Our school system, though, it treats the history of Black people as if it starts with slavery and is given small real estate in the textbooks. What I'm getting at is that there's something very wrong with the narrative in America in terms of what is taught to the children and even what is portrayed in the media by adults. And there are serious consequences to that. With England having been a colonizer and a major player in the slave trade, what is that narrative like? What is being taught? Is ownership of its role truly communicated?
So the answer is yes and no. So yes, there's a bit more ownership happening now, but only because the same way in the US, there's more movements around trying to shine a light on these sorts of areas. But the education that we get around areas such as slavery and empire is it's not non-existent, it exists, but a very, very different version of the reality. So, for example, the conversation about slavery, I'll tell you a bit about something that happened recently in the UK back in June, July time, which I think was very interesting. But our understanding of slavery in the UK and the way it's taught in our school system is that we are the people that helped abolish it. So a guy named William Wilberforce in the 19th century pushed and pushed for it, and then eventually we managed to abolish slavery. What isn't covered is that Britain was taking slaves from Sierra Leone over to the Caribbean before the Pilgrims had even landed in the US, right? So we were involved in this for like 200 years, and we were profiteering from it to a ridiculous extent. So our cities such as Liverpool, Bristol, and even London, their wealth is based on the profits of the slave trade. Even now, so slavers, there's streets, there's museums named after them in London, and even statues, which we had a bit of a flashpoint recently, and one prominent statue was pulled down in the city of Bristol. And I think that was quite an interesting one, because in the couple of days afterwards, that was the most momentum I've ever seen about people being educated on Britain's true role in the slave trade, being not exposed, but being recognized a bit more. But that quickly got twisted into another kind of culture war, which allowed people to disengage from the debate to an extent. So you're familiar with what happened with the Edward Colston statue in Bristol a few months ago?
No, please do tell.
Okay, so this was again in the wake of the protests after George Floyd's death. So Edward Colston was a 17th century merchant, and he was also a philanthropist. and used his profits to build up the city of Bristol quite a lot. So Bristol is it's on the west of England. I don't want to say how far it is from London, just in case I get that completely wrong. But he was central to the history of Bristol. There was loads of buildings named after him, but most prominently, there was a statue that was erected in 1895. And it was only in the 1990s that more people started to draw attention to the fact that, hang on, this guy was central to the slave trade. He profited millions and millions from it. And there was lots of democratic movements to get his statue removed, lots of petitions, but this hadn't moved at all. In the wake of George Floyd's death and the protests that were happening, protesters pulled down his statue and effectively threw it into the harbour. The police stood by and let it happen. So it's quite a mature act by the police, because the lead policeman in charge said that it would have escalated the situation by trying to stop this from happening. But in the days after, there was like an amazing positive reaction to this. So more statues were removed because more people were recognizing that, hang on, all these streets around us, all these statues in prominent places, of all these people profited from the slave trade. And I think even the Mayor of London called for statues and street names to be removed or renamed, and has actually set up a commission to review that. So lots of landmarks are currently under review as well. But like I said, there was a real recognition of this from at least the circles I moved in, which is a very narrow bubble, maybe, perhaps, but also quite wide one, I like to think as well. And I think there were other bits of education that came out of this as well. So people weren't aware that while Britain, the history we taught is around ending the slave trade, right? William Wilberforce in 1833. What many people weren't aware of was that we didn't quite just ban it because we thought it was really unsavory. We actually compensated the people that lost profits because the slave trade was ended, to the tune of £20 million in 1833. So do you want to ever guess what the equivalent of £20 million is in today's money?
Do dazzle me.
300 billion pounds.
Wow.
So what's that? 500 billion US dollars? Half a trillion? So if you were paying tax in 2015 in the UK, or had paid tax before then, you were paying off these slave traders who were profiting, and that was their compensation money. And I think the other thing behind this, which is also really unsavory as well, is that the people that benefited from this money are still around us. So the most prominent one is actually David Cameron, our former prime minister. So his ancestry were people that received compensation from the abolishment of the slave trade. But I think this wasn't truly the end of the slave trade as well, which I think I'll discuss a bit as we go on, when I talk a bit more about empire later on. But yeah, that is just one area of history we just nowhere near aware of. There's actually a recent documentary, I think it first aired last night, and I've recorded it so I can watch it later on. But it's a journalist called Afua Hirsch, and she's actually done a documentary with Samuel L. Jackson, and it's looking at Britain's role in the slave trade. So I'm hoping that education will start to increase, and that was prime time on the BBC. So I'm looking forward to watching that.
You know, I'm going to switch up the order of questions because you mentioned Samuel L. Jackson, and I came across an article just this afternoon. Kingsley Benadir, he played Barack Obama in Comey Rule, which was a two-parter by Showtime, and he's also in Regina King-directed film as well, playing Malcolm X. And so the interviewer from the LA Times asked him about, are you ready for the backlash? You know, a Black Brit playing two iconic Black American figures. And I want to share what he said. I know about the conversation. Look, no disrespect to Americans, but America is the center of its own universe, culturally. It's understandable that Samuel L. Jackson doesn't have a clue what it's like growing up as a Black man in inner city London. He probably thinks we're all sitting around drinking tea with the Queen, and it's not the truth. The accent can be quite deceiving. It comes with a feeling of privilege and an air of everything's rosy. I can tell you for a fact that standing up in a court of law here in front of a white judge as a Black man, you are 9 times more likely than your white counterparts to get a stiffer sentence. And then he shared one more thing, which I'd love for you to react to. Here's the other thing. James Baldwin and all these other Black people coming over to Europe in the 60s and going back to America and talking about how wonderful it was, were coming over as famous people. They weren't experiencing what it was like for my grandparents coming off those boats from the West Indies in the 50s, being spat on every day. They both worked as nurses in the country for 50 years. My grandma would talk about people bugging out because they thought she was the devil, and they'd have breakdowns because they didn't want Black skin touching them. I think that Kingsley, he brings up two great points, that there is this disconnect between England and America, even though, you're just over the pond, and there's some true misconceptions there, especially how it relates to race. And then secondly, that yes, those were celebrities. Nina Simone and they were celebrities, and they had a different experience, and that doesn't reflect the everyday experience of the Black Brits were there. But please, you respond to it, Jay.
Yeah, now there's a couple of things to unpick here, right? Because it's true that the experience that all people of color, Black people, and like my own family, when they came over from India or via East Africa, the people of Indian origin or South subcontinental origin coming from there, right? The racism they experience is very different to what we have now. It was more verbal, right? But this is one of the things that is quite interesting about racism that we have in the UK, in that verbal racism barely exists. It's extremely rare. And in the instances it does happen, everyone universally and like recognizes that this is a really, really bad thing. But one of the consequences of this is that the racism that we see in the UK is a bit more underhanded and covert. So it's one of those things where it sounds strange to say it, but because it doesn't happen, because no one's saying the N-word, right? People convince themselves that racism doesn't exist or is extremely rare, or because we have people of color in prominent political positions, it doesn't exist, which I'm sure might have been something that you guys saw after the election of Barack Obama as well, right? But like I said, I think it's one of those things where we've convinced ourselves in many areas, and there's so many tangents we could go off when we talk about British history, right? Because it's so big when you're talking about empire and slavery and all those things. But I think the key one is that in Britain, we're very good at telling histories, telling ourselves a new history. So there's one image I'm actually going to share with you, actually, and this links to empire. So I'm going to show this to you if I can make sure I share my screen properly. Can you see that?
Not yet.
Oh, let me see. How about now?
Here we go.
So this is some like a meme that became quite popular recently. But yeah, the Brits in British history book is the nice, cute-looking dog, and the Brits in every other history book are like this evil beast, right? And I think that's something worth talking about in a bit more depth as well, because, like I said to you, it's one of those things where because we don't say or do certain things, we think that we're not racist. We think we are these benevolent people that like are a step ahead of everyone else. And this is something that we see in the history of empire as well, right? Because whenever we're taught a bit about empire, it's the story of the benevolent British bringing civilization, technology, and wealth to savage countries. And I'm of Indian origin with proud Indian family members as well. So I thought I knew a bit about history. But the first I learned of empire's true malevolence was doing a post-colonial module as part of my literature degree. And I think I'll talk in a bit more depth about some of the things that we taught and not taught in later on as we go. But I think that's one of the things in the example you've just read out is calling out, right? We just convince ourselves of this alternative narrative in Britain a bit more. And I think because like that example of drinking tea and we're all happy and things like that, I think we like to export that view of ourselves to the rest of the world. Downton Abbey, that kind of thing, right? Because it's quite marketable. It's in our period TV dramas and things like that. I think the reality is that class is a big part of it. And I think that's something that unless you're living here, you don't really recognize and feel that, right? Especially if you're coming over as someone who's famous, right? Because class doesn't mean anything to you because you're famous. Everyone is like amazed to see you and wants to like let you into their amazing hotel or restaurant and things like that. So I can definitely associate with the feeling in that quote as well.
So I know we talked about the classroom and what's taught, what the educational system is like, and we definitely have issues here because I feel as if though if it's not up to the parents in order to teach what is the true legacy, right? Our history doesn't just start with slavery. You're not going to get it out of the school system. But to step outside of the classroom for a moment and to pivot back to media, as it's the industry you and I both work in, you've been pretty adamant about the racism on the covers and between the pages, above and below the fold of some of the British publications. And I saw this very interesting article that literally showed side-by-side comparisons of how Kate Middleton and Meghan Markle were treated in the press. Her being an African-American woman was hard for many to swallow. And she was downright vilified by the media. I think it came as no surprise to Americans when she and Prince Harry decided to move out and move on. But what I'm particularly interested in is beyond the scope of the royal family. How are Blacks treated in the media in England? Is there a commonality in how people of color are treated in general, or does it get nuanced and specific by race?
Yeah, 100%. So it's quite interesting you mentioned Meghan Markle, right? Because I think the people in Britain who hate Meghan Markle, I don't think they even believe they're racist themselves. They just think that Meghan Markle doesn't respect British traditions, right? I mean, what is that? Like, there was a story I saw yesterday in one newspaper about how she hadn't earned her royal title, so they should be removed. As if, like, how does a royal earn a title? I'm sure, like, they're born into it, right? No one earns it. So I think it's one of those where it's quite instructive, right? It's like one of those things where, like, how do you identify who a racist is? Just ask someone what their opinion of Meghan Markle is and how they try to justify it. And then that's a big telltale sign in my mind. But I think in terms of the way Black people are portrayed in media, I think there's one particular example that I've spoken to you a bit about, and that is around a soccer player called Raheem Sterling. So this guy, so I mentioned earlier that we don't really have verbal racism in the UK, and how when verbal racism happens, everyone calls it out. There's near universal condemnation of it. So, for example, Black soccer players playing for the England national team, they're routinely racially abused in Eastern Europe, for example, and that leads to a lot of outcry in lots of our newspapers. But this all came to a head recently because I think there's other areas we'll talk about, but I think we're in a bit more racially charged society generally at the moment. But this soccer player, Raheem Sterling, was racially abused by a fan during a game. I mean, I was watching that game live, and you can't hear what the fans are saying, but you could see the way the fans were leering over him, screaming at him. You can read their lips, and you knew exactly what was happening, and so would millions of others while they're watching in real time. But I've got an image of it for you as well, so I'll try and bring that up for you again. So you've got this image yet?
Okay, it's loading. There we go.
Yeah. So this was during the game. So this is just a still. If I've got the video, there's way more like energy and like hate in the way these like men are leering game. I don't know which one of these guys it was, but he was quickly identified, and actually I think he's either banned from games, or I think there were criminal charges as well leveled against him. And again, like I said, there was universal condemnation of it. But the interesting thing about the way this young guy was treated was there was context leading up to this, right? This wasn't something that happened out of nowhere. This was the kind of coverage he was getting in newspapers for, I would say, the 2 years running up to this. So there was a scandal around him having a machine gun tattoo on his leg. There was a story about how he had been showing off about how expensive his house was. There was accusations that he regularly cheats on his girlfriend. There were rumors going around that he has multiple children by multiple different parents. He only has one son. Like, that's always been the case. All these stories he was like incessantly hounded for these stories. I think he himself took a stand and said, no, I'm not going to stand for this. And about a year or so ago, called out a particular example himself. So he plays for a team called Manchester City. So he actually posted this on Instagram himself. So on the left, you see one story in the Daily Mail. So young footballer on 25 grand a week spends £2 million on a house despite never having started a match for the team. And then the story on the right, how this guy buys a £2 million home for his mum. So you can see the difference in tone already, right?
Yes.
And this is something that he was able to call out directly himself. And this is something that goes on all the time. And I said earlier that I think that class is a part of this. I think the interesting thing is that we regularly see different standards applied to black soccer players compared to white soccer players. And I think a lot of it is down to, like, this is an industry where they are earning lots and lots of money, right? It's one of those things where it's become a political football in itself, pardon the pun, in terms of how well paid these guys are. But the way that black footballers are portrayed compared to white footballers is quite stark. And even going into that, and I think there's a Key and Peele sketch about this, right? About I think one of the big TV networks commissioned some independent research to train up their own commentators on some of the racial bias in the language that they're describing soccer players with. So, for example, black players are more likely to be described according to their physical attributes, about being called strong and being quick, whereas white soccer players are more likely to be described around their ingenuity or their tactical awareness and things like that, right? But like I said, I think that's not indifferent to what you guys see in the US. I suspect based on this Key and Peele sketch.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you're familiar with it.
No, I don't. Now I need to go
look that up. But yeah, it's like, I think it's like a skit on ESPN, and one of the TV pundits is like, every single player that they put up a different player, a white player than a black player, and then the way the guy describes him. And Key and Peele just sat there like, are you not noticing any differences in the way you're describing these guys? And this is something where it's sort of progressed to an extent that TV networks independently commission this research and applying it and things like that. But this is the way black people have been treated in the media up until this point, until Raheem Sterling himself, he's just a young guy. He hasn't done anything to anyone. He's the guy that took a stand and said, no, that's enough. I might only be 24, 25 years old myself, but I'm saying, no, this is something I'm going to call out now. So I think it probably still goes on in terms of people that don't have the platform he has, right? Because he's a global superstar. But that is one particular example when you asked about how are people portrayed. And Meghan Markle's probably the one that you guys most see in the States. But yes, this does go on quite a lot.
Samuel Etienne, a British writer and former army officer, wrote for Al Jazeera that in the UK, Britons tend to look at the United States with smug contempt over the police brutality and overt racial injustice that's clearly on full display. However, Black people account for roughly 3% of the population in England, but 8% of deaths in custody. In fact, since 1990, only one police officer has been convicted for their role in the death of someone in their care, despite almost people having either died while in police custody or fallen in contact with the police during the same 30-year period. There's facts, there's data, yet the perception still holds. Why do Britons think they've somehow moved beyond racism?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons people in the UK don't really pay attention to this is because we don't have a militarized police, right? So, but that doesn't mean that the way that the police handle their interactions with the public isn't racist, right? So you said you've called out the disproportionate number of Black deaths in police custody. It's the same for stop and searches, right? It's something that always goes on, and even again in the wake of like COVID and like the way police have been handicap fines for people that don't adhere to the new social distancing rules. They are more disproportionately applied to people of color in the UK. So these things go on. I think because people aren't dying in the same way that they die in contact with the police in the US, it's less on the radar, right? But this is something that absolutely does go on in the UK. And I think, again, in terms of why do we not pay attention to it, I think because it's less visible, because it's less death around us, I think people are allowed to let it go. And I think we have a bit of a culture in the UK around, well, if you've got nothing to hide, then you shouldn't worry. When people talk about stop and search and things like that. But these people don't have to worry about, am I going to be late to work because I've been pulled over for no reason, right? And I think that's one of the things where I think UK needs to go through a growing understanding of, just accepting that racism exists and the consequences of it. Because like I said earlier, like we've boiled it down to, we don't say the N-word, so therefore we're not racist. Whereas I think in the US, it strikes me as you guys are much more aware of the small microaggressions that can disrupt a Black person's life, for example. Whereas here, I think we're a bit more behind in that education curve. Is that fair to say about the US, though, having not lived there myself, of course?
That's interesting. I came across a quote in doing my research that the UK is responsible for inventing racism, but America has certainly perfected it. And that was
Yeah.
like wow to me.
I mean, that's just a consequence of empire, right? I mean, like, what else was empire but like a racist enterprise to profiteer from and pillage, right? And it's interesting because, again, like when I was reading up a bit on this, so I think one of the major like pollsters did a big poll just a year or so ago, assessing Britain's view of empire compared to other colonial powers, because Britain weren't the only ones, right? Empire was happening, or colonial powers existed all across Europe, even Japan, these countries, right? So all these sorts of countries like Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Italy, Japan were all surveyed. And what this survey showed was that out of all those former colonial powers, Britain were the most likely to think that they had left their colonies better off and would still like to have an empire. So you think, like, what has gone wrong in our education of these of the reality of empire compared to these other countries? And I showed that one example earlier, but I think what it doesn't show is the way our museums and universities are still full of its spoils. So now you have this similar issue in the US, right, with um, uh, Confederate memorials, right? It's similar to us here. Like we have the British Museum, which is a beautiful building, and it's so educational when you walk around. And then you think, hang on, why is all this stuff actually here?
Right.
And even in our universities, I think in the debate around statues that were pulled down, I think there's another famous slaver slash someone involved in empire called Cecil Rhodes. He's quite prominent throughout some universities as well, and students have been long protesting for his removal as well. So, I mean, of course, people are going to think this about empire and colonies and race when the spoils of it all around us, right? They've never had to face up to it. And I think even in the context of World War II, right? So we fetishize the world wars in the UK a bit, and these are our big moment when we stood against fascism in the UK, but ignores the fact that Britain was backed by the biggest empire ever. And as part of that, the war effort, 3 million Indians were actually starved to death to feed the war front. So this is natural, and like empire is a history of massacres, famines, and violent transfer of wealth from away from these countries into the UK, right?
Right.
I think one of the interesting things, and I think this links back to race and the way I think Brits view race and the way you should behave when calling out racism and these kinds of things, and the way we behave around class and dignity and things like that as well. The way we talk about the breakup of empire is slightly perverse, I think. So in school, we're actually taught about Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, but the overriding theme is of Gandhi's non-violent pacifism and patience. And even Martin Luther King, a lot of his link back to the pacifism that he learned from Gandhi. And like this is such a narrow interpretation of both movements, right? And it's almost like you're being taught how not to rebel, right? Like so they're putting these prominent figures in front of you and saying, these are amazing people that did these amazing things, but remember, they did it by being non-violent. But that's not the reality when you hear about all these resistance movements. There are all these supporting figures around them. We know that Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, they were quite clever at provoking violence when it was able to bring the right attention and shine a light in certain areas, right? But we're not taught that sort of nuance. I think that's led to our warped sense of the reality of empire, how it ended because of Britain. I mean, we're made to feel like empire happened because of our benevolence and it ended because of our benevolence, right? It's just not the case at all.
I know you talked about how racism isn't really verbal in the UK, but the same journalist that I was talking about, Samuel Etienne, he was a former army officer, and he talked about how while things would never be okay in like just like commonplace society, there's like this subculture within the military and how you are subjugated to racial epithets, and it's just like, oh, it's in jest, get over yourself, come on. And I thought that was so interesting because there really is this like machine, if you will, like, no, we're progressive, we're not racist. And those truths, they're not truths. They're made up beliefs, and they really just need to be tackled, which is why I'm so glad that we're having this conversation. But I'm Jamaican and I live in America. And although my fellow Yachties, across the pond were impacted, I was late to the game in terms of knowing or even hearing about the Windrush scandal. And I have a strong feeling that I'm not alone. Because I know you're well versed on the topic, would you mind giving a brief description of what it was and ultimately what that even says about England?
Yeah. So before I jump into this, I think it's remind me at the end how the consequences of this are still ongoing as well. So I think because of empire, one of the interesting things that happens around empire, which I think is actually quite surprising when looking back now, is that Britain actually gave anyone born in a British colony the right of settlement in the UK. So that's one of the reasons it was quite easy for my grandparents to move here as well in the 50s themselves. They're of Indian origin, they came via Kenya. But the Windrush generation refers to migrants that came from the Caribbean in 1948 as part of Britain's need for labour in the wake of World War II. So I think one of the interesting things about this is because they have this right of settlement in the UK, this generation of people that came over weren't given any documentation when they came over. So what that meant was that their children also had no paperwork and their children had no paperwork, right? Well, this wasn't an issue. For years and years, this wasn't an issue. But what we have is I'm just going to say it might be a bit controversial, but we have a right-wing government in the UK. Some people will say it's right of centre. Doesn't matter. It is a right-wing government, right? And one of the things that they've had for a few years now is an actual policy called a hostile environment policy. So this hostile environment policy its aim is to just discourage illegal immigrants coming over and make it as hard as possible while you're here. And I think what this has led to is that because a lot of the Windrush generation, because they had no paperwork, that meant that they couldn't actually prove that they had a right to live in the UK. So what this meant that many of the descendants of the Windrush generation were wrongly detained, wrongly denied access to the country after they'd returned from a holiday, denied legal rights, and in some cases even deported. And in even more examples, more people lost jobs, lost their homes, even lost access to healthcare. So people have died as a consequence of this. Because of the hostile environment policy, people who had literally who had literally been born in the UK and never left the UK were deported to countries that had never even visited.
That's right.
Can you imagine this level of cruelty, right? And I think going back to the class aspect of this and how we deal with scandals and racism and these kinds of events in Britain, I think this is like quite an interesting thing. So the Home Secretary at the time when this was exposed was a lady called Amber Rudd. So she wasn't the architect of the hostile environment policy. That was actually Theresa May, the Prime Minister at the time when this came out. But she eventually resigned, but not because of the scandal itself and the pain that had been caused, but because she inadvertently misled the Home Affairs Select Committee. So basically misled Congress in the equivalent for you guys, right? But it gets better. So early this year, Amber Rudd was due to speak at an event at Oxford University for International Women's Day. And students voted to revoke her invite to speak there in protest at her part in the Windrush scandal. So for a few days, this became a mini storm in the media around how liberals had now gone too far and were now engaging in censorship. So the students that had voted to protest her got more criticism for revoking an invite than she had got herself for resigning for an administrative error. So it's interesting, the tone of reporting around the time of her resignation is more around that of a noble woman resigning for an honest error made by her team, rather than someone who had engaged in a flagrantly racist policy and damaged countless lives, right? And this is the way class works in the UK. You can do something that horrible and still land on your feet and get these gigs and feel like you are the one that is being wronged if someone protests you again 2 years down the line. And I say the consequences of this are still ongoing. There are still people in dispute about their right of status in the UK. There was supposed to be a compensation package for people that suffered because of this hostile environment policy, for the Windrush generation in particular. Those people still haven't been paid out. There are people that are in massive debt because they needed access to healthcare. I mean, in the UK, we have universal healthcare, free at the point of use. So for people to be denied it, you're going above and beyond to punish those people.
Wow. Let's talk about Brexit for a minute. It got a lot of coverage in America, but a lot of people also didn't understand exactly what was going on here. What were the ramifications? What was even the significance? I love if you could talk about that for a bit, as well as some of the lasting impacts of that, and what does it mean for Black and brown people specifically?
Okay, so Brexit itself is a whole can of worms on its own, right? But I think it is worth noting that a huge part of it was down to immigration. There'll be loads of people who will say that I've even spoken to people that are single issue voters on this issue because of a specific policy that's really local to them. But immigration was a big one, and the idea of taking back control, and specifically taking back control of borders. That meant to some people. Other people saw it as taking back control of your own laws, but I think immigration was a key part of it. I think what's interesting as well is that one Tory politician has actually been quoted as saying that Brexit was an opportunity for the empire to strike back. So read into that what you want.
Wow.
But one of the main consequences of Brexit is the end of freedom of movement. So between countries in the EU. So previously you could literally go and live and work in any of the other EU countries. So one of the central planks of the Leave movement was about ending this freedom of movement. So to fire voters about this was one of the key images of the campaign. So I'm going to share my screen again. So can you see that okay?
Yeah, it's loading. Wow.
So this was a poster that actually ran and was launched to much fanfare. And bear in mind that this is something about stopping the freedom of movement within European countries, right? I mean, these people aren't European, right? And I think this is something where, I'm just going to stop sharing now because I hate it so much. But in my mind, that is a dog whistle. In my mind, that says vote Leave to stop the darkies coming in. And the interesting thing about this is leaving the EU would actually take power away from Britain in turning away non-European migrants. So like, for example, there was a straight-faced debate a while back about how if we let too many Muslims into the UK, we'd end up having Sharia law. So it's one of those interesting things. So you called out the fact that only 3% to 5% of the UK population is Black. So compared to, I think, is it between 13 and 15% in the US?
Right.
What we have is a more predominant Asian community in the UK. So what we've seen, definitely post 9/11, is a lot of Islamophobia as well. And I think this is one of those dog whistles that was going on throughout the EU debate. But this is one of the things that informs the hostile environment policy, which led to the Windrush scandal. Because when I talked about Windrush, I didn't even mention that this was 2 years ago.
Sorry, this is what happens when you film live. This is my son.
No problem. Hello, Ryan.
Mr. J. Oh, very good. Okay, go ahead. I'm so sorry. That has never happened. Like episode number 4 or something like that.
That's real life. Don't worry about it.
Sorry. You were saying.
I was saying, like, so Brexit, this vote would happen in 2016. In terms of the long-term consequences, I don't know, because we're only due to fully leave in this coming December. So there's been a lot of toing and froing about what it would look like, what it won't look like. There's been it's been a bit of an interesting one in terms of one of the ways they've been able to sell this in is that we will be able to do way more trade with the rest of the world, with India, with Japan, and all these countries, right? But we don't know what the reality is actually going to look like. But what this actually will mean, and again, this is something that people might call out as controversial, but I don't think is up for debate. But it's going to be quite damaging to the economy. And anytime that there is damage to the economy, even with things like the global pandemic that we're all suffering from, people of color are the first people to suffer in a suffering economy, right? I think what we're seeing as well in COVID-19, we're seeing lots of key workers are immigrants are from the EU and non-EU as well, and they are a disproportionate number of deaths. So bus drivers, for example, healthcare workers, they are more likely to be Asian or Black or EU migrants. And these are the people more likely to die as a result of being key workers, right?
Same here. Wow. In an article by CNN, Piers Harrison Reed, a nurse and performance poet based in England, wrote in response to the George Floyd protests. And if we aren't heard with the knee or with a raised fist, how else can we resist? I think the greatest trick racism ever pulled was convincing England it doesn't exist. Given recent events and where we are right now, do you think England's mind and views are changing? Why? And if not, what can we do to get there?
So it's a really interesting question, right? Because there's what you're living in the eye of the storm, right? And then what happens on a real macro level. Because one hope I always have is that if you look at populations as a whole, like youngsters, that kind of thing, so we are more liberal than we've ever been, right? But this is not like translated into the governments we have and things like that. And I talked about earlier the Edward Colston statue coming down. Like when you see the video of that, it felt so powerful. And like I felt so buzzed. And I think there was a real like passion around educating people on the reality of Britain's role in slavery. But this debate was hijacked very, very quickly. So what happened was, so I mentioned all these statues that came down, and some were removed quite quickly. And there's like Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, is leading a commission to remove some of them. There was actually a lot of negative reaction to this. So lots of right-wing politicians criticised this as vandalism. And the concept of statues being pulled down in acts of vandalism became the centre of a culture war. So the newspapers. So while we don't actually have a Fox News equivalent in the UK, we actually also have very little liberal media in the UK. So we have a couple of newspapers, but the newspaper industry is predominantly right-wing, and they set the agenda for the news channels. So a news channel won't be as flagrant as Fox News, but they will follow the agenda set by these newspapers, right? So I think there was a lot of scaremongering in the country about how protesters were coming after British heroes. So I'm going to share one more image with you.
Please.
Let me know when you can see this.
Yeah.
So this was a couple of days after. So as part of the protest, so there's a prominent statue of Winston Churchill in central London, and someone graffitied Churchill was a racist on it. I mean, he was a racist. He's on record saying horribly racist things, as well as starving 3 million Indians as part of the war effort, right? So what happened was another protest a week or two after the Edward Colston statue came down and his statue was graffitied. His statue was boarded up just for protection from vandalism, right? But this was the newspaper front page. So set our greatest hero free. And in a shameful surrender to the mob, Churchill's statue is boarded up. So this is the kind of way that like these kinds of debates get hijacked very quickly. So another example of what we saw from this as well was recently we have this cultural event run by the BBC called Last Night at the Proms. It's like a live orchestra. They perform in front of a crowd, and it's broadcast live on BBC prime time. And because of COVID restrictions, what that meant was that there was going to be no audience in attendance, and also to protect the actual artist performing it as well, it was going to be music only with no singing. So the Sunday Times, so the paper of record, the Times, printed this story as the Black Lives Matter movement stopped a particular song being sung because it evokes memories of slavery and empire. That was never the case at all. No one involved with Black Lives Matter cared about this song being sung at all. No one even knew no one cared about the lyrics of this song. It's a song called Rule Britannia. And this led to about 2 weeks of outrage in our newspapers and on TV about, is the Black Lives Matter movement going too far now?
Wow.
So we made a little bit of progress. People were talking about this, people becoming aware of our history around slavery. And then we have these hysteric overreactions to trivial stories, right?
And a way to detract from the real issues too.
Exactly. And I think this is one of the things that I know this is how you and I got to talk. I know we worked together, and So we're not in the same office, and it might be a long, long time before we get to meet in real life, right? But the reason we ended up meeting and speaking was because I was quite passionate about the way our media covers, doesn't help racial equality and equity in the UK, right? So I showed you an example from the Daily Mail, and we have similarly right-wing newspapers as well, like The Sun, there's others. But like people sort of know what they're getting with those newspapers, right? They know that they're almost like comic books, right? Because they're just so ridiculous. I'm sure you have similar equivalents in the US as well. I think what's really damaging and really is instructive for the kind of racism we see in the UK is that there is a real like covert, underhanded racism that goes on in the more highbrow newspapers, such as The Times, for example. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples, if you don't mind.
No, please.
So again, this story was off the back of the Edward Colston statue coming down. So it's by an writer called Melanie Phillips, and we're giving into the race revolutionaries. So I've pulled out a particular quote from this article. So yet, having been inculcated with the unchallengeable belief that they are victims of white society, Black people believe that any disadvantages they may suffer is not the result of bad luck, circumstances beyond anyone's control, or perish the thought, their own behavior, but must be the product of white racism. So these are the kinds of themes that we see in like our highbrow newspapers that metropolitan liberals read in their leafy suburbs, right? And it's interesting. So this writer, Melanie Phillips, so she regularly appears on BBC TV panel shows. And the scary thing about this lady, she regularly still writes for the Times now, but she was included in Anders Breivik's manifesto. So Anders Breivik is the Norwegian terrorist who killed well over 50 people in a political terrorist attack going back a few years. He quoted her in his manifesto. And like she still writes for the Times. It's crazy, right? And the Times, it doesn't stop there. So this is another example. So this story of Britain is the cocaine capital of Europe. And you can see the image at the headline at the top of this story, right? But in this actual story, on the right-hand side, this is the ethnicity of cocaine users. Like, that is ridiculous, right? Like that is racism, right? No one's using the N-word. No one is saying that Black people are cocaine users, but that's what they're trying to say, right? No one's saying it out loud, but even though it's categorically not the case at all, this is a story that newspapers are implicitly telling people, right? And I think the last example I'm going to end on is, I think it's very significant when you think about the type of people that write for these newspapers. So have you, you've got the show I May Destroy You, I believe HBO might have this show.
Yes. You know, it's so funny. A friend of mine recommended it. I have yet to check it out yet. It's in my queue though.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. So I highly recommend it.
Okay.
So this is in a review of I May Destroy You in, I believe it's the Daily Telegraph. So it's really funny. So, well, it's not funny. It's actually quite sad. You can read the description, and I'll read out the last bit of it. This new drama is so brilliant, you don't watch it thinking that most of the characters are Black. That's irrelevant. They are human beings equipped with the full repertoire of virtues and vices. So this writer suddenly realized that Black people have thoughts and feelings and characters too.
Right.
Like it's
wow, what an aha moment.
Yeah. So, and I think this is where a lot of when we talk about the racism we have in the UK, it's like I said, no one ever says the N-word, right? But this is, we have this like, it's not quite, well, it is white supremacy, right? But it's based in more things than skin color. It's also about class. It's about language. It's all these things, but also convincing yourselves that you are better and therefore you would never do something so horrible. Whereas I think what we see in the US is it's a lot more overt, right?
Wow. Jay, I've learned so much in this conversation. Is there anything else that you'd like to share that you feel like we haven't covered?
No, I think the only thing I'd say is that, like I say, I'm no expert in any of these areas, Monique. I'm just someone who's passionate and interested and been motivated by people like you. So thank you again for getting me involved in this kind of thing. Like, if anyone is ever interested in the things I've talked about, then please get them to reach out via you, and I'll point them in the direction. There are some really prominent writers out there doing some amazing things. I wish I could call them all out. I think one of the best examples of people describing what the lived experience is for Black people and people of color in the UK is Rennie Edo-Lodge. So Why I No Longer Talk to White People About Race. It's an amazing book. It's a life-changing book. So I'd highly recommend reading that as well. But there's so many more examples, and hopefully I've done all the people that have done all the hard work for me, the justice in articulating some of the areas that go on in the UK. This is by no means comprehensive, right?
Right.
And thanks again for taking the time to listen as well.
Of course. Listen, you said it. You are passionate, but Jay, don't discredit yourself. You are also knowledgeable, which is exactly why I asked you to speak to my Don't Stay Silent listeners. One last thing before we close the show. I always ask for my guests to fill in the blank. I say, don't stay silent 3 times, and you fill in the blank.
Okay. Oh, God.
I didn't tell you. I wanted to be off the cuff.
Yeah.
Okay. So, don't stay silent
about what you're feeling. So I think this is the thing, like, how do we educate people about microaggressions if we don't start to articulate what we feel and what we see every day?
Yes. Don't stay silent
about anything at all. That's a bit of a cop-out, right? If you say something, see it. Because like I said, I think one of the reasons I'm doing this with you now, and the reason I met you, is quite simply because like I said, mentioned earlier, we worked together in one of our all hands. Someone who I've not actually met read out a poem, and that she had written when the protests after George Floyd's death were at their peak, right? And I found that so powerful, so emotional. And I thought, this person is so brave to speak up, and this is something where I can and should be doing more. And so don't stay silent about anything. If you have something on your mind, talk about it.
Yes. Last one. Don't stay silent.
Don't stay silent. If you don't understand something, ask questions, because that's the only way we're going to get better, right? I think like I actually before you and I even met as well, I actually did like a short part of our team meeting where I just took people through a few bullet points, just taking them through, look, this is why the protests are going on. This is some of the context that you might not be aware of. And here's some useful tools if you ever have a conversation with family around the dinner table. Mm-hmm. And it was like really like 5-minute intro, just saying, hey, like if you ever want to chat to me, let me know. And a couple of people have come forward and asked me questions like, is it okay to ask people how to pronounce their names? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. Don't make a mistake or don't avoid it. Just ask people. So I think don't be afraid to ask if you don't understand something.
Nice. Wow. You know, I really honestly and truly believe that we all have our own spheres of influence, but the onus is on us whether or not we're going to use them. So that's powerful. This conversation was powerful. Thank you for your time, Jay. This was great. I can't thank you enough. And to the viewers, Jay said it. Don't stay silent. Thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. Bye, Jay. Thank you.
Bye.